He left his phone on the kitchen counter. He left it there because he was coming back for lunch. Because the walk was 3 hours, maybe less, a route he had done before through terrain he knew in mountains he had spent years learning. Because leaving your phone behind when you are going for a 3-hour walk in a place you know is not a mistake. It is a decision that a reasonable person makes on a Tuesday morning in June when the weather is good and the trail is familiar and lunch is waiting. Lukas McClish was 34 years old. He was an experienced hiker. He understood these mountains in the specific way that people who walk in a place regularly come to understand it, not as a map or a set of directions but as a landscape, a collection of landmarks and reference points and known routes that exist in the body as much as in the mind. The mountains he walked into on June 11, 2024 were not those mountains. They had the same geography, the same ridgelines, the same canyons, the same general shape against the sky. What they did not have were the trees. What they did not have were the trail markers. What they did not have was any of the visual reference architecture that makes a known landscape navigable, because fire had taken all of it. The CZU lightning complex fires had moved through this section of the Santa Cruz Mountains with the completeness that only wildfire achieves. The old-growth trees that had provided shade and orientation for years were gone. The wooden trail signs were gone. The undergrowth that had defined the edges of the paths was gone. What remained was a landscape of charred trunks and new growth, identical in every direction, offering no information that the eye could use to establish position or direction. He took a shortcut. The shortcut did not go where he expected it to go. Within hours, the 3-hour walk was no longer a walk. It was something else entirely, something that was going to last 10 days. This is the Unlost Files. And this is the true story of Lukas McClish. The Santa Cruz Mountains run along the California coast south of San Francisco, a coastal range that rises to approximately 1,100 meters and contains a mix of redwood forest, chaparral, and the specific post-fire landscape that the CZU lightning complex left behind in August of 2020. The fires burned approximately 350 square kilometers of land, a swath of terrain that, in the years following, regenerated in a way that experienced hikers have described as disorienting even when they know the area. The new growth fills in the spaces where the reference points used to be. The trails that were defined by the trees on either side of them become corridors through vegetation that looks identical to the vegetation beside it. The burn pattern is not uniform. Some sections recovered faster than others, creating an inconsistency that the eye interprets as landmarks where no landmarks exist. Lukas McClish knew these mountains before the fire. He did not fully know them after. He was wearing the clothes he had put on for a 3-hour walk in summer, appropriate for 3 hours, not for 10 days. He had a headlamp. He had a Leatherman, the multi-tool that experienced outdoor people carry as a habit, the kind of item that lives in a pocket or a pack without anyone thinking specifically about what it might eventually be used for. He had no food, no water, no means of communication. No one who knew his precise location, because precise location had not seemed like information anyone would need before lunch. When the trail stopped making sense, when the shortcut he had taken deposited him in terrain that did not correspond to anything in his mental map of the area, he made the decision that survival protocol consistently identifies as the correct one. He stopped moving and tried to orient himself. The landscape did not cooperate. In every direction, the post-fire regeneration offered the same visual information. New growth, charred trunks, the specific gray-green of a forest reasserting itself over burned ground. There were no distinctive features. There were no sight lines to peaks or ridges that would have told him where he was relative to where he needed to be. The landmarks that had organized this terrain for him over years of walking it were gone. He began to understand that the afternoon was going to end without him finding the trailhead. Water was the first problem, and he solved it with the pragmatism of someone who has assessed the available options and chosen the least bad one. He found a small canyon with a waterfall, a feature the terrain provided without ceremony, a trickle of water coming down a rock face into a pool at the bottom. The water was there. The problem was getting it to his mouth in a quantity that would make a difference without a container of any kind. He took off his boot. A hiking boot is not a cup. It is not designed to hold liquid. It is designed specifically to shed liquid, to drain, to resist saturation. What it is, structurally, is a container with drainage holes, which is a compromised container but a container nonetheless. Lukas filled the boot from the waterfall pool and drank from it, repeating the process as many times as the boot's drainage rate allowed before the water was gone. This is the kind of solution that the human mind produces when the normal solutions are not available. Not elegant, not comfortable, functional. He drank from his boot every time he found water, which became the organizing principle of his movement through the terrain. Not navigation toward the trailhead, which he could not locate, but navigation toward water, which kept him alive to continue looking. He found wild berries. He ate them without knowing precisely what they were, not randomly, not without assessment, but with the risk calculation of a person who understood that some uncertainty about the identity of food is preferable to the certainty of starvation. He was losing weight. He could feel it in the quality of his movement, in the specific lightness that prolonged caloric deficit produces, a lightness that is not the same as feeling light. The days developed their own structure. Movement in the daylight, attempting to find the trail. Listening for sounds, vehicles, voices, aircraft that would indicate a direction toward people. Calling out on the chance that someone was close enough to hear. Making camp at night on whatever ground was available, in the clothes he had worn for a morning walk, in the mountain air that drops significantly in temperature after dark even in June. And then, on one of those nights, he heard something in the dark that was not the forest settling. Mountain lions are not animals that announce themselves. This is not an incidental feature of their behavior. It is the central feature of their predatory strategy. They are ambush hunters, built for silence and patience, capable of covering ground with a quietness that bears no relationship to their size. An adult mountain lion weighs between 60 and 90 kilograms. It moves through brush without disturbing it in ways that would register to the human ear as movement. What Lukas McClish perceived in the dark was not the sound of the animal. It was the quality of the silence around the sound, the specific cessation of the smaller sounds that the forest produces when something at the top of the food chain is present and attending. He saw it once, a shape at the edge of the darkness, in the range where the headlamp's light gave way to nothing, large enough to be immediately identifiable for what it was. Still, in the way that animals are still when they are watching rather than moving. It did not approach. It did not retreat. It remained at the boundary of his light and watched him the way predators watch things they are assessing. He shouted. The behavior of shouting at a mountain lion is documented in wildlife encounter guidelines. Loud, assertive noise, making yourself appear as large and threatening as possible, maintaining eye contact. The goal is not to frighten the animal, exactly, but to communicate that the encounter will cost it more than the encounter is worth. Mountain lions are not indifferent to risk. They are calculating animals, and the calculation they perform on any potential prey includes the possibility of injury. Lukas McClish shouted every night for 10 days. He shouted to drive the lion away. He shouted because shouting at the top of his voice was the only available response to the thing that was watching him from the dark. And he shouted because shouting was also, possibly, the thing that would carry far enough through the canyon terrain to reach someone who could follow the sound. He slept in intervals because sleeping fully was not something his body permitted in those conditions. The cold worked against sleep. The lion worked against sleep. The understanding of his situation worked against sleep. He lay on leaves and breathed and kept his headlamp on and waited for the light to come back. On June 16th, 5 days after Lukas McClish had gone for a 3-hour walk, his family realized he was missing. The delay was not negligence. Lukas was a man who spent extended periods away for work, days at a time unreachable in the way that some kinds of work require. The specific alarm bell of his absence did not sound until Father's Day dinner, when the chair at the table stayed empty and the phone went to voicemail in the way it had been going to voicemail for 5 days, but was now doing so in a context that made 5 days of silence mean something different than it had the day before. The search that began that evening was large. The Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office coordinated search and rescue teams across the burn-scar terrain, deploying the resources that a missing person in wilderness conditions requires. The terrain was not cooperative. The same post-fire landscape that had disoriented Lukas disoriented the search teams, and the density of the new growth that had replaced the burned forest created overhead cover that complicated aerial observation. He was calling out. Every night he shouted. The canyon terrain that had trapped him also carried sound in specific ways, amplifying in some directions, absorbing in others, creating an acoustic environment in which a voice could travel further than expected or not at all, depending on the geometry of the walls. On day 10, 2 people in the forest heard something. Not his words. The sound of a human voice, distant, irregular, coming from somewhere below them in the terrain. They stopped. They listened. They reported what they had heard. The Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office deployed a drone equipped with thermal imaging, a camera that does not see visible light but reads the heat signature that every warm-bodied object produces relative to its surroundings. The canopy of the new-growth forest that had hidden Lukas from aerial observation did not hide his heat signature from the thermal camera. In the footage from that drone, he appears as a white shape in a green-gray world, a point of warmth in terrain that had no reason to be warm in that specific way. A K-9 unit was directed to the location. They found him at the bottom of the canyon. He had lost significant weight. His shirt was gone, lost at some point in the 10 days in circumstances he later described without the specific detail that might have explained it. He was covered in the accumulation of 10 days in a post-fire wilderness. He was standing when they reached him, which is the detail that appears in every account of the moment and that carries, for anyone who understands what 10 days in those conditions costs a body, more information than any description of his physical state. He was standing. The medical assessment after his rescue established the expected damage of 10 days without adequate food or water in mountain conditions. Significant weight loss, dehydration, the skin damage that extended wilderness exposure produces, the exhaustion that does not immediately resolve when the cause of it ends. What it did not find were broken bones. What it did not find was the injury that a mountain lion attack would have produced, because the mountain lion had watched him for 10 nights and had not attacked. What it did not find was the category of outcome that 10 days alone in post-fire wilderness, without food, without communication, with a predator tracking you, tends to produce. He was alive. He was intact. He was, by the specific medical definition that matters, fine, damaged and depleted and in need of recovery, but fine. His family was at the hospital. In the accounts that followed the rescue, the news reports, the interviews, the social media posts from search and rescue volunteers who had been in the field for 10 days, several people noted the same detail. The phone on the kitchen counter. The phone he had left because he was coming back for lunch. He came back. Took 10 days instead of 3 hours. The lunch was cold, but he came back. There is something about Lukas McClish's story that is different in texture from the other stories in this series. He was not an extreme athlete. He was not a scientist in a remote location. He was not on an expedition that anyone had identified as high risk. He was a person who went for a walk. The gap between going for a walk and spending 10 days alone in a burned forest with a mountain lion tracking you is not a gap that announces itself. It does not come with warning signs or escalating danger or the kind of progression that would allow a reasonable person to say, "I should have stopped here." The snow bridge failed. The storm hit. The ground gave way. In Lukas McClish's case, the trail looked the same after the fire as it had looked before until it didn't. The shortcut seemed reasonable until it wasn't. The 3-hour walk became 10 days because the terrain had changed in ways that only became apparent after the change had already determined the outcome. He drank from his boot. He ate berries he couldn't identify. He shouted at a mountain lion every night for 10 days to keep it from deciding he was worth the trouble. And on the 10th day, 2 people heard something in a canyon and stopped to listen, and a drone found a point of heat in a landscape that had no reason to be warm. He was standing when they reached him. That's the whole story. And it's enough. This has been the Unlost Files. Subscribe if you want more. Leave a comment with what stayed with you, because with Lukas, the detail that gets people is always different. I'll see you in the next one.